5 on Finniston Farm. Chapter 11. A most exciting talk. The boys were busy hammering and sawing, and the girls sat and waited till the noise died down. Snippet was there, leaping about ridiculously with little bits of wood in his mouth, and Nosy the jackdaw had suddenly taken a fancy to the shavings that now covered the floor, and ran about checking and picking them up. Outside, the hens clucked and squawked, and not far off, the ducks quacked loudly. "Those are the kind of noises I like to hear," said Anne, settling herself on a sack in a corner. She raised her voice and shouted above the hammering to Dick. "Want any help, Dick?" "No, thanks," said Dick. "We'll just finish this job, then sit down and have a rest and listen to what you have to say. You sit and watch our wonderful carpentering. Honestly, I'd make pounds a week if I took it up." "Look out! Nosy has got your nails again," shouted George. Timmy leapt up as if he was going to chase Nosy, and the jackdaw promptly flew up to a crossbeam and sat there chacking with laughter. Timmy thought him a very exasperating bird indeed. He lay down again with a thump. At last the boys had finished the job they were on and sat down, rubbing their hands over their wet foreheads. "Well, now you can tell us your news," said Dick. "Good thing we got rid of that little pest of a Junior. I might have hammered a few nails into him by mistake if he'd come worrying us this afternoon." He imitated Junior's whining drawl. "Aw, shucks, Pop, let me come with you." Outside, his ear to the hole, Junior clenched his fists. He would willingly have stuck a few nails into Dick at that moment. George and Anne began to tell the 4 listening children what old Mr. Finniston had told them that morning. "It's about Finniston Castle," said Anne, "the old castle that gave the village its name, and the farm as well. The old fellow who told us about it is called Finniston too, and will you believe it, he's a descendant of the Finnistons who lived in the castle centuries ago. He seems to have spent most of his life trying to discover everything possible about the old castle," said George. "He'd said he'd delved into old libraries and into the church records here, anywhere that might help him to piece together the castle's history." Outside the hen house, Junior held his breath so as not to miss a single word. Why, his pop had told him that he couldn't get anything out of that old Mr. Finniston at the antique shop. Not a word about the castle and its history, or even where the site was. Then why had he told Anne and that horrible boy George? Junior felt angry and listened even more keenly. The story goes that in the 12th century, enemies came to attack the castle one night, and there were traitors already inside it who set it on fire so that the castle folk would be busy trying to put out the fire and wouldn't be prepared for a fight, said George. The inside of it was burnt right down to the ground, and then the great stone walls outside collapsed inwards and lay in enormous heaps there, covering the place where the castle had stood. "Phew," said Dick, visualizing it all. "What a night that must have been. Everybody killed or burnt, I suppose." "No, the lady of the castle wasn't killed, and it is said that she took her children to the little chapel near the farmhouse. We really must go and see that, twins. And they stayed there in safety. Anyway, some of the family must have escaped, because it is one of their descendants who keeps that little antique shop, old Mr. Finniston." "This is tremendously interesting," said Julian. "Where's the site of the castle? It should easily be known because of the great massive stones that fell there when the walls collapsed." "No, they're not there now," said George. "Mr. Finniston said he thought that when the wind and weather had broken them up small enough to be lugged away by the farmers and peasants living nearby, they were taken to build field walls or to line wells. He said there was some on his farm. He didn't know himself where the castle once stood, because the site would be all grown over, and with no stones left to mark it, it wouldn't be easy to find." "But, oh, Julian, I wish we could find it," cried Anne, her voice rising in excitement. because, so Mr. Finniston says, the cellars and dungeons are probably still there, quite untouched. You see, no one could uncover them for years because of the heavy stones there, and when the stones were taken away, people had forgotten about the castle and the dungeons. Gosh, so they may still be there with whatever was stored in them hundreds of years ago, said Dick, thrilled. My word, there might be priceless things there, as old as the hills. I mean, even an old broken sword would be worth its weight in gold because it would be so very, very old. I say, don't say a word of it all in front of that American, or he'd dig up the whole farm. We shouldn't dream of it, said George. He shan't get to hear a word of this. Alas, George little knew that every single word had been overheard by Junior, whose left ear was still pinned to the knothole in the wood. His face was red with surprise and delight. What a secret! Whatever would his pop say? Dungeons, perhaps full of gold and jewels and all kinds of things. He rubbed his hands together in delight, thinking that he would soon get even with those annoying children now. As soon as his pop came home, he'd spill everything to him. Gee! Timmy heard the small sound of Junior rubbing his hands together and sat up, growling, his ears pricked. Snippet growled too, a miniature little sound that nobody took seriously. Timmy then heard Junior creeping away, afraid because he had heard the big dog growling. Timmy growled again and then barked sharply, running to the shut door of the hen house, scraping at it with his foot. Somebody's outside, quick! If it's Junior, I'll throw him onto the muck heap, yelled Dick, and flung open the door. They all trooped out and looked around, but there was nobody there. Junior had shot off at top speed and was now safely behind the nearest hedge. What was it, Tim? Said George. She turned to the others. He may have heard those hens scratching near the door, she said. There's no one about. Gosh, I was so afraid that it was that little sneak of a Junior. He'd tell his pop every single thing. Twins, listen, Mr. Finniston told us that one of the things that was saved from the castle, or found afterwards, perhaps was a great old oak door, iron-studded, said Anne, suddenly remembering. Is that one of your kitchen doors? Yes, that must be the door leading into the dark little passage, said Harry. You wouldn't have noticed it particularly because it's usually kept open and it's very dark just there. Gosh, I suppose it could have come from the castle. It's enormously thick and strong. I wonder if Dad knows. We'll tell him, said Harriet. I say, shall we go and look for the site of the castle sometime? If only we could find it. Do you suppose that if we found the cellars and dungeons full of chests and things, they'd belong to us? The farm belongs to our family, of course, and all the land round. Does it? Well then, of course anything found on this land would be yours, said Julian. We might be able to buy a new tractor, said the twins both together in the same excited voice. Let's go and look for the castle site now, said George, her voice sounding so excited that Timmy sat up and barked. No, we must finish this job, said Julian. We promised we would. There's plenty of time to hunt around because nobody knows about this except us. Julian was wrong, of course. Junior knew, and Junior meant to tell the whole secret to his father as soon as ever he could. He could hardly wait for him to come home. Well, we'd better be getting back to the house, said George. We told Mrs. Philpot we'd pick some raspberries for supper tonight, so we'd better fetch baskets and begin. Oh, I do hope we find that castle site. I shall dream about it tonight. I know I shall. Well, try and dream where it is, said Julian with a laugh. Then you can lead us straight to it tomorrow morning. I suppose you haven't any idea where it might be, have you, twins? No, they said together, frowning. No idea at all. And Harriet added, you see, the farm's so big, and I suppose it might have been built anywhere on our land. Yes, but probably near the top of a hill, said Julian. castles used to overlook surrounding land, you know, so that approaching enemies could easily be seen. And then again, George said Mr. Finniston told them that the lady of the castle escaped with her children and took them in safety to the chapel, which wouldn't be very far away. I should guess that the castle site must not be further than a quarter of a mile from the chapel, so that narrows the search down a bit. By the way, we really must look at that chapel. It sounds interesting, even though it has been used as a storehouse for years. The girls picked raspberries for the rest of the afternoon, and the boys finished their jobs. They went back to the farmhouse for tea, feeling pleasantly tired. The girls were already there, laying the table. They pounced on the twins, and George spoke excitedly. "Twins, we've been looking at the old studded door. It's magnificent. Come and see it, Julian and Dick. If it isn't from the old castle, I'll eat my hat, and my shoes as well." She took them to the great door that opened from the kitchen into the passage that led to the yard. With much difficulty she swung it shut. They all gazed at it. It had been almost too heavy for George to move. It was a very stout and strong and made of old oak. Great iron studs had been driven into it so deeply and firmly that only by destroying the door itself could they ever be removed. There was a curious iron handle in the middle of the outer side, and George raised it and brought it down smartly. A loud bang resounded through the kitchen and made the others jump. "The knocker that visitors used when they came to the castle, I suppose," said George, laughing at their surprised faces. "Noise enough to rouse everyone and alert any guard at once. Do you suppose it was the front door of the castle? It's big enough. It must be worth hundreds of pounds." "Look out, there's Junior," said Anne in a low voice. "He's grinning all over his face. What do you suppose he's been up to? I wish I knew." Chapter 12. Really very thrilling. At tea time, Julian spoke to Mrs. Philpot about the old kitchen door. "That's a fine old door," he said. "Did it come from the castle, do you suppose?" "Yes, so it said," answered Mrs. Philpot. "Great-Grandad here knows more about it than I do, though." Great-Grandad was not at the table. He was sitting in his enormous old chair in the window with Snippet at his feet. He was pulling contentedly at his pipe, a cup of tea on the window-sill beside him. "What's that?" called the old man. "Speak up." Julian repeated what Mrs. Philpot had said, and the old fellow nodded. "Why, that door's from the castle, all right, made of the same oak as the beams in the barns and the floors of the bedrooms above. Aye, and that American fellow's been at me about it too. Offered me £50 for it. £50! I wouldn't take 1,000. What, have that old door hanging in some new-fangled house out in that American country, wherever it is? No, I say no, and I'll say it till I'm blue in the face." "All right, Grandad, don't upset yourself," said Mrs. Philpot. She spoke to Julian in a low voice. "Change the subject quickly, or Grandad will go on and on. Poor old fellow." Julian racked his brain for a change of subject, and fortunately remembered the hen houses. He at once began to tell Great-Grandad all they had done that afternoon, and the old fellow calmed down at once and listened with pleasure. Snippet, who had run in fright to the twins as soon as Great-Grandad had begun to shout, ran back to him and settled on his feet. Timmy also decided to join them, and soon Great-Grandad was completely happy again, drawing on his old pipe, with one dog at his feet, the other resting a great head on his knee. Timmy certainly did love Great-Grandad. Mr. Henning did not come back that night, much to everyone's relief, but arrived next day just before lunch, bringing with him a dried-up little fellow wearing thick glasses, whom he introduced as Mr. Richard Durlston. "The great Mr. Durlston," he said proudly, "knows more about old houses in England than anyone else in the country. I'd like him to see that old door after lunch, Mrs. Philpot, and that queer opening in the wall of the bedroom upstairs, which was used to heat embers and bricks for warming beds years ago. Fortunately, Great-Grandad was not there to object, and after they had had dinner, Mrs. Philpot took Mr. Durlston to the old studded door. "Ah, yes," he said, "quite genuine, very fine specimen. I should offer £200, Mr. Henning." How Mrs. Philpot longed to accept such an offer. What a difference it would make to her housekeeping. She shook her head. "You'd have to talk to old Great-Grandad," she said, "but I'm afraid he'll say no. Now, I'll take you to see the queer old opening in one of the bedrooms." She took Mr. Henning and Mr. Durlston upstairs, and the four followed with Timmy. It was indeed a strange opening in the wall. It had a wrought iron door, rather like an old oven door. Mrs. Philpot opened it. Inside was a big cavity, which had obviously been used as a kind of oven to heat bricks for placing into cold beds. Some of the old bricks were actually still there, blackened with long ago heating. Mrs. Philpot took out what looked like a heavy iron tray with an ornamented raised edge. On it were old embers. This tray was used for heating and holding the embers before they were put into warming pans, she said. "We still have one old warming pan left, there on the wall, look." Bang, bang, slap, 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 slap. "We still have one old warming..." And again. "We still have one old warming pan left, there on the wall, look." The four, just as interested as the two men, looked at the copper warming pan glowing red gold on the wall. The red-hot embers were emptied into that, Mrs. Philpot told the children, and then the pan was carried by its long handle into all the bedrooms and thrust into each bed for a few minutes to warm it. And that funny little opening in the wall is, as I said, where people years and years ago heated the embers and the bricks too, which were wrapped in flannel and left in each bed. Very interesting. Quite rare to see one in such a well-preserved state, said Mr. Durlston, peering into the opening through thick glasses. You could make an offer for this too, Mr. Henning. Interesting old place. We'll have a look at the barns too, I think, and the outbuildings. Might be a few things there you could pick up with advantage. George thought it was a good thing the twins were not with them to hear all this. They seemed to share with their great-granddad a hatred of parting with any of the treasures belonging to the old farmhouse. Mrs. Philpot took the two men downstairs again, and the four followed. "I'll just take Mr. Durlston to the old chapel, ma'am," said Mr. Henning, and Mrs. Philpot nodded. She left them and hurried back into the kitchen where she had a cake baking. The four looked at one another, and Julian nodded his head towards the two men now making their way out of doors. "Shall we go too?" he said. "We haven't seen this chapel yet either." So they followed the two men and soon came to a tall, quaint old building with small and beautiful arched windows set high up in the walls. They went in at the door a few paces behind the two men and stared in wonder. "Yes, you can see it was once a chapel," said Julian, speaking instinctively with a low voice. "Those lovely old windows, that arch there, and the feel of it," said Anne. "I know now what old Mr. Finniston down at that little shop meant when he said that though it was now a storehouse, it was still full of prayer. You can feel that people have been here to pray, can't you? What a lovely little chapel. Oh, I do wish it wasn't used as a storehouse. I was told by an old fella down at the village antique shop that a Lady Philippa, who was once the lady of the castle, brought each of her 15 children here to learn their prayers," said Mr. Durlston surprisingly. Nice old story. Probably true. Chapels were often built near castles. Wonder which path they took from the castle to the chapel. All gone now. No castle, nothing. I'd like to buy this chapel, knock it down, and take it stone by stone to my place in the States," said the American enthusiastically. "Fine specimen, isn't it? It would look wonderful in my place." "Can't advise that," said Mr. Durlston, shaking his head. "Not in good taste. Let's go to those outbuildings yonder. Might see something in the old junk there." They went off, and the children stayed behind, entranced with the little chapel. Sacks upon sacks of grain and what looked like fertilizer were arranged in rows all over the floor. A cat had 3 kittens cuddled together on one sack, and a dove cooed somewhere high up in the arched roof. It was a very peaceful sound, somehow just right for the silent little place. The children trooped out quietly, not feeling inclined to follow the brash Mr. Henning round any more. At least the other man stopped him from his mad idea of removing the chapel stone by stone, said Anne. "I couldn't bear that beautiful old place to be torn up by its roots and replanted somewhere else." "You sound quite angry, Anne, almost as fierce as old great-granddad," said Julian, slipping his arm through his sister's. "I don't somehow think the old chapel will be sold to Mr. Henning, even if he offered $1 million for it." "Well, I like most Americans very much," said Anne, "but not Mr. Henning. He wants to buy history just as if it were chocolate or toffee." That made the others laugh. "I say," said Julian, "what about having a snoop round now we're out, and just see if we can decide where to hunt for the site of the castle? I presume we all agree that it can't be very far from the chapel?" "Yes, that's agreed," said Dick, "and it's also agreed that the site is probably on a hill. The snag is that there are rather a lot of hills on this undulating farmland. Let's make our way over there, up the nearest slope," said George. "Hello, here are the twins. We'll call them. They might like to come." The twins soon joined them and said yes, they would certainly like to hunt for the castle site, but it might take years, said Harry. "It might be anywhere on the farm." "Well, we plan to examine this first slope," said Julian. "Heel, Tim, heel, Snippet. Oh gosh, here's Nosy the jackdaw too. Not on my shoulder, if you don't mind, Nosy. I'd rather value my ears." "Jack," said the jackdaw, and flew to the twins. They made their way up the slope. There was, however, absolutely nothing to be seen except grass, grass, grass. They came to a big mound and stood looking at it. "A very large mole must have made that," said Dick, which made them all laugh, for the mound was as high as their shoulders. Rabbit holes could be seen at the bottom, though it was probable that very few burrowed there now. The great rabbit disease, myxomatosis, had wiped them practically out of existence on Finniston Farm. Timmy couldn't see a rabbit hole without scraping at it, and soon he and Snippet were scattering earth over everywhere. Snippet was small enough to disappear into one hole, and came out carrying, of all things, an oyster shell. Julian took it out of his mouth in amazement. "Look here, an oyster shell, and we're miles from sea. How did it get here? Go in again, Snippet. Scrape hard, Timmy. Buck up. An idea is glimmering in my brain." Before long, what with Timmy's excited scraping and Snippet's explorations deep into the burrow, quite a collection of oyster shells and small and large bones lay on the grass. "Bones," said Anne. "Not bones of people, surely. Don't tell me that this is a mound covering an old grave or something, Ju." "No, but it is something rather exciting," said Julian. "I'm pretty sure it's an old kitchen midden." "A kitchen midden? What on earth's that?" said George. "Oh, look, Timmy's got another mouthful of oyster shells." "A kitchen midden is what you might call the rubbish heap of the old days," explained Julian, picking up some oyster shells. "It was often very big when it comprised the rubbish thrown out from large houses or castles. Things like bones and shells wouldn't rot away like other rubbish, and I do believe we found the kitchen midden of the old castle. My word, what a find! Now we know something very important." "What?" asked everyone in excitement. "Well, we know now that the site of the castle must be somewhere on this slope," said Julian. "The kitchen midden was probably not far from its walls. We're on the scent, Scouts. We're on the scent. Come on, let's go further on. Spread out, examine every inch of the ground."